Yeah, she sent me your email, so you'll be good to go. For the people taking early finals, you're gonna leave this classroom at 5:30 and go find someplace independent and quiet. As I stated last week, your plagiarism is not tolerated in this class. We are reading every test and comparing it to other tests that were read. We're professionals at this. We know how to read for this. We know what this test should look like. We also know what it looks like when you write, because we have your midterms. So you spread out. Don't be tempted to work with your friends. This is not a joint project. I made a statement about this last week. It still remains to be clear. The same statement remains. Spread out. You should be taking their test by yourself. This campus is large enough for you to do that. So the people taking early final are expected to do that. I will be grading every single early final myself. So I will be cross-reading those exams to make sure that there is no plagiarism in them. So like I said, spread out, don't ask for help. You have open book, open ended, open note, but you cannot talk to your friends or your classmates about the material for this exam. At that point, they made it clear. You sure? Okay, good. So again, 5:30, I will make an announcement. You go make yourself scarce at 5:30 and go get yourself set up to take the exam. For the early final, again, this information is only for people taking the early final. Make sure you follow the file name requirements I put out on chalk. Did you get that message from me? If you're a graduating senior, make sure that you follow the directions I put on chalk, otherwise your grade won't be posted on time. So for the graduating seniors in attendance, is that clear? Did you? I can't hear anybody.
Yes. Yeah.
You got that? So if you don't get your grade posted on by Saturday, don't blame me if you didn't do what I told you. All right? It's very simple directions. Otherwise, I'll have a link up on chalk for you to submit the test. People who got the time extensions of midterm will get the appropriate time extensions that they should otherwise receive. There's nothing to be done special about that. Elsewise, your grades and your memos will be tabulated, and even if you didn't get a specific confirmation on pass-fails, we will check emails to make sure that if you put in a pass-fail, conditional pass-fail request, that it will be tendered appropriately. And if there's a problem, we will let you know before we post a grade. And again, as I wrote in the email, grades are due for us on Saturday because they are posted electronically, not Friday. So if you don't see a grade on Friday and you're a graduating senior, do not email me telling me what the deadline is. Because I just told you what the deadline was. I get this message every time I TA a class, and I'm tired of reading it. So I've already answered the question. So when are grades due for graduating seniors? Saturday. Saturday night. You'll have your grades posted before Saturday, not Friday. Don't message me. I don't want to read your messages, and neither will the professor. So that's that. Again, that's early final folks only. Everybody else, your regular final will be released on next Wednesday on time. Are there any questions about the format of the final, what should be done? And also, let me also say out loud, there is a perfectly good review guide that I wrote that I've been giving out to every single class I've TA'd for Professor Clark in the last 2 years. This guide has not changed. It is on the announcement section. If you have not read this guide by now, you are screwed. That is not my fault. Don't come ask me when you see your final grade if you didn't read this review guide. I can tell that you didn't read the review guide because the points that you lost on the midterm, the majority of you fessed up that you didn't read my review guide. So I know this to be true. I've done the sample survey and I know that I have enough data to prove that I gave out enough information to get people the grades they want. You need to read my shit. The way that you do this is print it out with actual ink. Take a highlighter or a pen and highlight, draw a circle, and make sure you read everything I wrote in the 4-page review guide so that you don't give up the points on the final. The answer to get an A on the final is written in the review guide. The test model will not change. The essay model will not change for people taking the general test. So nothing is changing. So read the review guide and make sure that you understand it. And if you don't understand it, email somebody, a TA, by the end of the weekend. Yes?
What's the difference between the early and the regular final performance?
As stated previously, early final takers have no choices. The people on the early final are going to see exactly 2 identifications. Each one is going to be worth 10 points. As I wrote in the chalk post, it's about 2 hours ago. No, you read the chalk post, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to say it out loud just to make sure, because I make it my habit to write clear directions. You are going to write as much relevant information in a very short and concise manner about the 2 IDs in order to get the maximum 10 points while following the things I wrote in the review guide. I'm not going to mention what I wrote in the review guide because I know everybody read the review guide, right? Yeah, right. Either way, yeah, it's basically more dense than IDs from the midterm. but it's the same information is to be expected, just more of it, and still concise. So don't write me an essay length ID, because it's only worth 10 points.
Okay.
You have 2 of those, and you have exactly 1 essay to do.
Okay.
That's the price of me grading all these tests early, is that you get less options. It makes it easier for me to have consistency, so I can grade more exams quickly. That's why it's done. Everybody else in the general final will receive a test design similar to the one they took for the midterm, with options built in place. That's on that end. Any other questions on the protocol of the test? Because the professor's gonna come in and likely talk about 1 or 2 things that students bring up as questions related to academic points. This is your time now to about anything about the test or how to maximize points on the test or anything else. Oh, to wit, if you're turning in memos, they're due at 12:01 on Friday. Reading day is Thursday, so nothing's due on reading day. 12:01 on Friday, that's Thursday night. Anything that you owe for this class, unless you're a term paper writer, which you have a specific set of deadlines, anything that you owe, whether you're a graduating senior or anybody else, 12:01 Friday, June 2nd. Anything you owe to us that's not a research paper, and those students again have a separate set of protocols, 12:01 Friday, June 2nd, anything you owe for us that needs to be graded, you need to give it to us, even if you're a graduating senior. So that's different than what was told to you earlier. 12:01 Friday. That gives you all the reading day to get your shit together for this one class and to get it sent out, so that way it can be graded appropriately. Has that been made clear? You got it? 12:01 on Friday, June 2nd. Memos, anything that TA's told you to do for extra credit, anything I told you to do to repair midterm grades, 12:01 Friday, I need everything in place so we can start grading, because the TAs, we have our own work to do, and we also want to start our summers on time. No late work will be accepted from undergraduates and graduating seniors. Turn your stuff in on time, don't ask for extensions for that type of stuff. You had the time to do it, it's extra credit for most of you anyway. 12:01 Friday, June 2nd is the deadline for all written material that is not a test. 12:01 Friday. I've said it several times, so that way no one in attendance and no one in YouTube should ask me, because I'm not gonna tell you by email when things are due. Are there any other questions? Because ask your questions now, there are no dumb questions. I wanna make sure that everybody doesn't have the problems that were had on the midterm. I've been taking great pains to make sure that you folks can get the grades that you want to earn the way that you would like to earn them. I've taken my own personal time and extended office hours, and people who have been in my office hours can testify that I stayed in place to make sure to help everybody that wanted help. So take the opportunity now to ask questions, and don't sit with information in your head that you don't know. If you have a question or a thought, ask it now, so that way you don't have to extend it. And once I give the class to the professor, he's gonna cover some basic course material that might have been missed, and then you're gonna be dismissed, and that'll be the end of that. Yes?
When are final papers due then?
Final papers, you owe a draft to your TA sometime between now and Friday. Your TA should have set a date for that. Your ultimate deadline is 4 p.m. on next Wednesday, which is the date of the final for everybody else. So again, if you owe a research paper, your TA should have told you a date to expect a draft. Your final copy that will go to the professor for grading is due at 4 p.m. next Wednesday, the same time that everybody else takes the final exam. Yeah. What's your name? Email me right now. And when I go sit down, I'll put you on the list. You might be there already, but email me right now so I can put you on the top of the list. That way I won't forget. Are there any other questions related to the protocol of the test, the manner of the test? The test needs to be assigned on chalk. The chalk system worked for all but 5 of you, so I know that the chalk system works out fine, so everybody is going to be expected to use chalk to upload. If your chalk is not working, that's on you. Take your computer over to the Regenstein and have those folks over there help you fix your chalk. Again, all exams, because there's too many of you, all exams are due by chalk. Early final takers and people taking the general test next Wednesday, because chalk worked out for most of you, so that means that few people who had chalk issues, that was specific to you. So you need to go solve those specific issues, so that way I can have all exams received and distributed without having to go hunt down exams for anybody. Since the majority of the 93 people who took that exam had no problem using chalk to upload their data, everybody is expected to use chalk to upload their exam as required. Make sure that your chalk works before you take the exam. Are there any other questions before I yield the desk? All All right. For me personally, I will be tendering questions around to the final exam until Monday night. After Monday night, I'm going on radio silence in order to prepare for the exam. Other TAs might have different requests. What that means, if you want to talk to me specifically about the midterm, about the final exam, you have until Monday night, and then after that, I'm switching off. I cannot extend questions until the last minute, and I know that people sometimes study things at the last minute, but I have my own work to do. So again, if you want to talk to Antoine specifically, I'm going offline for final questions. Also, I will not tender any emails or conversations asking me about deadlines, because I just stated them out loud. I will also not tender any statements asking me what should a memo look like, because it's week 10 on a Wednesday, and we have talked this issue to death. For the folks that just joined in, because I started a bit early, people who are taking the early finals need to split.
Video.
Yeah. Well, no, we have people taking early finals. You need to split at 5:30 p.m. And again, for folks who just walked in, the deadlines for any written material, graduating senior or otherwise, memos, extra credit, or anything else that was told to be written that's not a research paper, is due at 12:01 this Friday, which is just after reading day ends. All right,
Terrific.
We covered so.
Thank you, folks. Thank you, Antoine. Our last session, I came in with two guys who said, this is our last class at the University of Chicago. We're graduating, so it's a big day. Beautiful weather, beautiful weekend. It's something I've seen in Chicago, sort of a scene effect. People get cabin fever during the winter. They stay inside. They turn the heat up, and then when it gets warm like now, look at their smiles, look at their clothes, look at the outfits. They look better than ever. So, okay, enjoy it for at least a week or two. And go ahead and dress yourself. All right. So, got some white pants on for the summer myself. Questions on any theme, any topic? We've got 2 or 3 things we can do today, but first of all is questions. We can come back to this, but let me just wait for, yeah, go ahead.
Can you talk about the institutional logics from the third sector? Are those important?
Okay, good. This is a term we use in the book called the third sector with Megan Kalman and me. She was a grad student here, and she was an executive director of about 5 or 6 different voluntary associations in Bolivia, in Washington, D.C., in India, I think. She's worked all around the world. We were invited by the Chinese government to do specifically the Ministry of Civil Affairs, to talk about, to analyze, do a book with a Chinese colleague on how national governments or how national organizations, national states, variously support or whatever civic associations. They have different names like NGOs in the US, service organizations more often in China. And the main point is these things are quite new in most of the world. They're old in really England and Scotland, where they started with the so-called non-conformist churches organizationally. In contrast to the Church of England or the Roman Catholic Church. So on the European continent, the church and the state are supposed to do all this. So you don't have civic associations. Napoleon said, no civic associations in France, basically. And that style is one of intolerance, which in the city of Chicago 10 years ago, they still talk about independent organizations. Independent of what? Anybody? They try to crush them, drive them out, try their members and whatever. And that was the job assigned to Jane Byrne when she was the #2 staff member of the regular Democratic organization after it had a new law in 1970, probably 72, 74, no, 60, yeah, 70, 72. So 68 was the Democratic Convention in Chicago. 4 years later was was the reaction against it, against class politics. That in turn was the culmination of lots of local organizing effort by people who were fighting the daily style. And one of their programs was every local Democratic Party organization must have 2 chairs, a man and a woman. And Jane Byrne was the woman, and she worked with Daley, who was the #1 chair, and her job, and she gave a 45-minute lecture on this that I attended when she was first running for mayor herself, was how she destroyed the local independent organizations with Daley, and that was her job. And how proud she was of being tricky and sneaky and figuring out what they would try to do, and then and that should be a qualification for her to be mayor, was the implicit message. Okay, so point is, the context of these organizations, civic, independent, voluntary, church, Lions Club, Boy Scouts, varies a lot. Chicago, with Jane Byrne's example, is very different from, let's say, Palo Alto or a suburb of Seattle or whatever else. So what we did in the whole book, as you saw in Kentuckville Karaoke, is to deal with the big question of where and why do civic organizations have certain kinds of leadership impacts. And then one big policy output for citizens is trust. And so the Tuckville theory basically is civic organizations lead to more trust. And that's Robert Putnam continuing this, and in his Bowling Alone book he says this is a crisis of democracy because civic organization membership is going down. Therefore, we may lose legitimacy, leadership, all kinds of things, and that may in turn undermine trust in political institutions. And in the minds of many, that is what's behind the election of Trump. The people have become more individualistic, they're less embedded in their neighborhoods. This is one of the key propositions in the paper. We have two co-authors represented here, Kelton and Sam, and Sam are 3 of the co-authors. This is one of their key propositions, and they find support for it, basically. Less neighborliness, less, okay, I won't go into the complications. But if that's the background for saying, hey, don't assume these things are the same everywhere, but ask what leads to the local characteristics, the scene characteristics, which transform how A, B, C, and so forth work. And so you've heard me say, a good theory has propositions, arrows and boxes and arrows like this, and the context. The context then says what kind of transgression, localist, neighborly, state-dominated context shifts the way that these things work. And so basically in China, the Chinese government is essentially trying over time, over 20 years or so, basically, to let people have more autonomy, more citizens, average citizens, do more, think more, talk more, engage more, without necessarily bringing down the whole government and the whole economic and political system. They don't want a Russia, they don't want an Eastern Europe where the whole thing collapsed. So they're trying to change slowly. So rather than having an election, they do have local elections in some villages, but they don't have national elections the way we do here, and so an alternative is to have civic associations do more. And so that's in part why they invited us to do the book, to say what are other governments doing, how do these things work all around the world. So we have chapters on China, US, France, Korea, Taiwan, and we compare and contrast the national policies which led these things to shift in how they work. And the way then, after it was, the book was published in Mandarin about 3 years ago, and we just published it this last year in English, but we revised it quite a bit. And we added to the English version only what your question was about, which we call, put it right over here, institutional logics. And because Megan Kelman is listed as the senior co-author, she didn't want to use the word scene because she'd heard that for too long. So she brought in a new word called institutional logic. And then we apply it not to the whole neighborhood of the local area, we apply it more to the organization. A more general term for this is organizational culture. So people at Stanford have written about organizational culture. It's the same basic thing. The question is, what are the rules of the game by which organizations or neighborhoods or families or universities work or don't work? And the key point here is, rather than saying they're all the same, or we don't know how they work, or it's too complicated to talk about, or each one is different, we try to say here are 4 or 5 types. Okay, so one is the state dominated. China, strong state. And bureaucracy. I mean, the bureaucracy rules. And so, in a sense, you can say when someone asks you, why'd you do that? You say, because there's a rule, and I'm just following the rule, period. Another is patriarchy. So you have an older guy, or say, maybe we don't call it, maybe it's sort of paternalistic, or that is, we'll take care of you, we'll help you, we'll be charitable, and you don't need to do everything yourself. We'll try to help you out. I mean, that's another principle of traditional 19th, 18th century charity, which is involved here. Another is clientelism. You know, you help me and I'll help you politically. And so some of these organizations are quasi-political, or they may be involved in neighborhood level exchanges with civic groups, with business groups. So they're doing some of that. In a sense, these are the general, more traditional background, traditional in these 4 different senses. Then 2 big new ones are sort of I'm blocking on the names, but one is sort of civic individuals. I mean, you can find them there if you want. Anybody wants to read them to me, we can have them brought forth. But one is really, what do citizens do as activists, sort of the local activists? And the implicit idea is, I mean, we're activists because the system is wrong, or it's doing something wrong, and we want to change it, or at least we want this organization to do it better. So the challenging idea of the activist is in conflict with all of these previous 4. So the activist, the local citizen activist, is one more. Then the last one, I believe, is sort of the professional staff member. You get a master's degree in management or in nonprofit management in a business school or a public policy school. Yale started these. Yale, I think Duke, others has started these. Chicago now the business school has a degree in nonprofit management, and the whole Harris School is basically doing this kind of thing. Okay, so you can be a professional. Then you're trained that you're sometimes entrepreneurial. You sometimes respond to the donors. You work with the boards, but you may pull these things together. But you do it in a way that you're a professional, especially, let's say, foundation manager. You're the director of the MacArthur Foundation on helping people with disabilities or low-income neighborhoods. And so if you do that well, then you can go to another foundation, or you can go to a university, or you can go to a city government or the federal government. And that's a style which has become professionalized, the way that law and MBAs and Masters of Fine Arts have become more professionalized in the last decades. Okay, so the idea is these institutional logics are in conflict, and different organizations fight with each other over these kinds of things. And they in turn shift the way that things get done. So if you heard that before about scenes, of course, it's the same core ideas as you have for scenes, but we apply them to the organizations. Follow-up questions? No. Okay.
We have a YouTube question. I have 2 students asking about yuppies and how they relate to scenes, or how they affect scenes.
Okay. I think the 2 quick answers. One, there's the crude answer, which is young urban professionals. Let me back up. Where did the label come from? Younger. I mentioned this in class. Anybody remember? Which city did the concept emerge in? Chicago. Why Chicago? you had these young professionals all around the US, all around Europe, Asia, and so forth. The point is, these were a new style which was in conflict with a traditional Irish, Polish bar, like neighborhood, ward church, and traditional politics. So the Tribune and people in bars started talking about, no yuppies in my bar. That is, there was a sense that these people were different, and we didn't want people, and so the definitions I would hear from my neighbors, people who carry the Wall Street Journal, sip on a Starbucks coffee, and walk the dog are people we don't want in this neighborhood. Okay, so those are crude indicators of a cosmopolitan, national, international, somewhat affluent lifestyle. Okay, crude exterior labeling. Do people who have a college degree and who come from outside a neighborhood challenge a neighborhood? Do they want to destroy the old bars? That was the question asked by a woman whose book is on, I think it's on the bibliography at the end, with a great name, Japonica Brown Saraceno. And she studied 3 or 4 neighborhoods. She's lesbian herself, and she actively talked about, she has a new book on lesbians, and the general point, now I'll illustrate it with the lesbians. She studied 4 towns from, I think, Portland, Maine to Ithaca, New York, somewhere else, and then a place on the West Coast. And even though there may be a, quote, lesbian or a yuppie national imagery, her point with the lesbians was in these 4 cities, the lesbian ethos, the leading organizations of lesbians were totally different. They were sort of business women with elegant suits who were very businesslike and not explicitly in any way different from heterosexual folks in Ithaca. Whereas on the California beach, they lay in bikinis, they flirted with each other, they had a much more engaged sexual lifestyle, so that is, you can have drastically different cultures which are not even isomorphic with a label like gay, lesbian, rich, poor, young, urban professional. Okay, so her bigger point of this is, these things are culturally constructed. They're not biology. They don't come out of, they don't just come from outside. You can create a new way of living if you want to. And so she then looks at and talks about people who may move into a neighborhood. And one of her towns was Andersonville, the neighborhood called Andersonville in Chicago, which was a traditionally Swedish neighborhood. And there were lesbians who came from New York and California, and they learned how to dance the traditional Swedish dances on the holidays in the Swedish neighborhood in Chicago because they admired the traditions and they wanted to preserve the traditions. They were not acting like yuppies who were destroying the traditions of the neighborhood. So that's a critical point. So Shannon Morrison, who was registered in this class, she's come a couple of times. She made a workshop presentation yesterday on her MA, or MAPS MA, where she's studying these variations around the US, and specifically she's doing field work in Atlanta. But basically, she's elaborating the degree to which people, artists, leaders, civic activists can transform the whole image of artists, or lesbians, or young urban professionals, or something else. So, in a sense, what it also illustrates is a general point you've heard me make several times. Race, class, gender, and national origin explain about 15%. They're not insignificant, they're not irrelevant, but they don't explain everything. 85% of the variation in most of what social scientists study, most of what people care about. Do you go to church? Which church? How often do you go shopping? How often do you go to a restaurant? I mean, those kinds of questions, standard kinds of questions, standard kinds of activities. 15% of people's behavior is explained by their race, by their gender, their national origin, whether you're Polish or not. And and 85% is not. The point is, local culture, local institutional logics shift the way we think and act. And if you move around from place to place, most of you are not from Chicago, you're from all over the world, all over the US. Many of you are very cosmopolitan. You lived in 2, 3, 4 places, and you talk explicitly about, I learned to do this in Iraq, I learned to do this in, and so, I mean, Christina is a dramatic case. I mean, she's got a Japanese background, she lived in Brazil, she studied in Italy, she studied in England, she's now in the US, she's got all these languages, and she can see how all these different cultural perspectives are in conflict with each other. So not only is she as an individual more cosmopolitan, she can talk about where and how they can come together or merge or fight and so forth. But the point is, this is going on within our own heads, within our associations, within our neighborhoods, and that's part of why we have these political transformations and shocks going on around the world. The election of Trump and of Brexit and so forth, these are reflections of the more general experience, lifestyle shocks and changes that people are feeling. And so fear of foreigners and people from the outside are sort of the top of an iceberg that, you know, life is not the way it was when I thought I knew what it was. In France, in England, Germany, and Nebraska. Any more?
We have 2 more questions
more.
here.
Wow,
Yes.
okay.
One is if anybody's shy, then just ask here that I'll okay. The first one is, how is electronic media contributing to the development of a scene?
Okay, lots of papers on this, for sure. I'd say that the simple way we answer it is, it's not as if one is in conflict with the other. I would say the electronic media are a new resource. The way we normally show that is what we call an interaction effect. So rather than saying it's a separate effect like that, we may have, say here, electronic media. And then we can say, how do electronic media strengthen or shift or transform each of these intermediary paths? And I would say our expert who gave a paper on this, you wanna give a 2-sentence answer to the question? Remind everyone of your name.
Oh, I'm Lauren.
Lauren Angeline. Okay. And she had a presentation last week.
Yeah, that's
Okay. So take a look at her. I mean, so concepts, fandom, the internet, yeah, etc. But
yeah. So I'm just looking at how scenes can be used to actually look at online communities, similar to the way you would look at traditional communities. And do we talk about how they impact real world communities? Because that's not as much.
yeah, but I say we just tick off. Look at her. I mean, you can read what she said, or listen to what she said. But the more general point is, one can try to thoughtfully use these general concepts from the course, so that when this question comes along to any of you on an exam or in life, you can say, what have I learned that will help me use my iPhone? Or if you go to Turkey and you're in a village, to think about how the people in this village are doing things differently, and why are they different, and how might I react in turn so that I don't get shot, expelled or mistreated, or how they will see me as a friend and an ally rather than the opposite. So that is, so what she's done is take certain concepts and then creatively adapt them to a new situation or new technology or new Facebook, whole series of things, Twitter and the like, which she's covered over, and then she's identified how people shift in conjunction with fandom. Let me just add one more important point, which she didn't stress in her presentation, but she did last quarter, which is, as we have in Asia, most dramatically, but the same thing here over a generation or 10 or 20 years in the US and the West, we have a decline of parental authority. Parents are less and less saying, don't do that, do this. They're sort of saying, Johnny or Sally, what would you like to do next? And so as that shift moves down, and as parents say, you know, or they either say, what would you like to do, or say, I don't know, Johnny, I'm not sure what I would do in that situation. What does Johnny or Sally do? According to Lauren, they connect with a whole lot of fandoms on the internet. Or if you're, let me add one more, you're in Korea. You're in Korea, there we go. Grandma says, you know, you have a curfew at 10 o'clock, you can't go out to that protest meeting, you can't go and strike and shout, you can't go to the bar, so what do? You go to the internet. And you've got wild, active, engaged, political, social stuff on the Korean internet, as well as much of Asia, if you look. Okay, so what this in turn has then led to is people who no longer, they may officially respect grandmother, but privately, when they're asking themselves, what, you know, who am I, what lifestyle should I lead, what are my political views, where do I get information on this or that, they look for people who they follow, and follow as an official term on Facebook and on Twitter and so forth, in ways that then you can have the next step. Lady Gaga, if you send her emails, she gets lots of them. She replies to them. And she probably, and other people like that, may not have in mind only Heesun. If Heesun, I don't know if you've written to Lady Gaga recently, but maybe if you write to her and write a general question that is of concern to many people, she gives a general reply, and maybe hundreds of thousands of people are interested in that reply. But that then in turn is a way of having a new alternative, a surrogate mother or father who is related via social media and shows the illustrations of the workings of fandom in new ways that help to complement, challenge, compete with traditional authority, especially in this case the family, the church, the neighborhood, and these other kinds of legitimating criteria which were more important in the past, and they are now as life has gotten more and more egalitarian, more civic or citizen-oriented, more individual, more bottom-up in style, so it's a way that scenes change through a dynamic of the fandom which Lauren has analyzed, and with some subtlety in this respect, and with a lot of, it's basically a qualitative, sensitive analysis of the actual text that people are sending to one another. Another question?
Yes, two more. So,
okay.
Can you elaborate on Habermas and gender roles, and also court life in relation to gender roles?
Okay. Habermas was a student of Adorno and Horkheimer in Frankfurt. In the time when I was there, he'd just been appointed to the university, and he'd just been appointed based on what we don't have it's a post PhD. They have a PhD in Germany and France, but they have another degree that's maybe 5-10 years later, and it's called in Germany Habilitationsschrift, and that's the book we have on the reading list. I'm making the point that Habermas was close to Adorno and Horkheimer socially, career, and so forth, but he broke with them. That is, the big theory we saw at the beginning in this course and elsewhere was the paper on Hollywood by Adorno and Horkheimer. And their simple view was, as I put it, Hollywood links capitalism and capitalism with citizens, not by doing what we talked about of Lady Gaga and fandom. Lady Gaga and fandom, in a sense, are a way of helping citizens be more autonomous and develop their independence and their own combination of values and perspectives. Adorno's view is the opposite, namely that capital dominates, and it comes from Marx, of course. But how does it work? Why should it dominate, and how? If capital is just money in the bank 1,000 miles away, how can it dominate people in little towns everywhere? And the simple answer they say is Hollywood films and advertising. Okay, and they just sort of state it like that in a fairly blunt, simplistic manner. And as I pointed out, Adorno's a brilliant guy, but that paper is crude. Habermas looked at that kind of thing and said, let's look at this more carefully. So he has hundreds of pages and he looks at the variations. Instead of saying this is the way it works everywhere, he said, let's look at gender roles, let's look at courts, let's look at kings, let's look at how these things work. The media, where did the media come from over the 19th century? And he shows many of the media were developed by artists in a more artistic style at the beginning, and then gradually advertising came in certain German newspapers and so forth. Okay, so he has examples, especially Germany, France, and England. But the big contrast is France and England in the court. And the French court around, especially Versailles, Louis XIV, really, Napoleon went there, his parents brought him there to grow up so he would understand the politics and the subtlety of how the court worked. And the French court had top people from, dukes and others from around France, as well as people from Poland, from Russia, who would go and visit for a while, and so from Italy, from Germany. That is, it was the most brilliant. Louis XIV was called the Sun King, and the sun radiated around the world. At least the French like to think, but they wanted to do things as Louis XIV himself said, "Le superflu chose très nécessaire." The superfluous is a very necessary thing. Okay, conspicuous consumption is a classic illustration right there. He also was, as were most of the French kings in that time, and most of the leaders on the continent, they were authoritarian. They didn't want dissent. They didn't want challenge. They didn't want independent civic groups or whatever. And so the state either outlawed them, or everyone assumed that the government, the hospitals, the public housing authorities, the public education, the minister, they would take care of the problems. By contrast, in England, it was different for multiple reasons. Basically, the English had a federal system internationally in their colonies. It lives on today. In the governments, say, of the U.S. and Canada and Australia, where you have a federalist system, state, local, counties, townships, and so forth, each of which overlaps in their authority. Lifestyle is not dominant in any one right or wrong way. You have these more tolerance of these alternatives. And the most dramatic case was the so-called nonconformist churches, especially Calvinists, who in the 19th century especially built churches and translated the Bible into Swahili, into different Hindu languages, and then had courses where they taught people to read for the first time, and they would teach them about the Bible. And the point was the British colonial administrators permitted this. They didn't do it. They didn't build the schools, but they said if the church wants to do it, the Baptist church, the Methodist church, if you want to do this in Zimbabwe or South Africa, you go ahead. And so they did. By contrast, in Belgium, in France, in the German colonies, in the Portuguese colonies, in the Spanish colonies, if you tried to do that, you would be killed, put in jail, taken away, whatever that is. There was no autonomy to have this kind of dissenting perspective. Similarly, you had local elites in rural areas of England who would be also London political and economic elites. They were doing stock market stuff and so forth. And so you had a lack of sharp segmentation between the rural and the urban, between the bourgeoisie and the nobility, and between men and women to some degree, although earlier it was more sexually gender segregated. Later on that was not the case. Okay. In that context, what Habermas then contrasts is where and how did these gender roles emerge, and how did they relate, especially in terms of this course, to context and culture, and how did these shift place making? The quick answer is the court in Versailles and on the European continent was dominated by the authoritarian political leader. But what did everybody else in the court do? They gossiped. They had intrigues. They might assassinate people, or they'd steal things, or they'd have a love affair with someone else, etc. Those were gossiped about continually, and then people would figure out ways of rising or falling or trying to rise, and then there were novels written by Balzac, by Stendhal, how to succeed, how to get to Paris if you're in a small provincial town. And if you're a local priest, you start as in The Red and the Black, most famous novel of Stendhal, and you become a tutor to the leading family. You do well with the wife of the leading family. Then you go to Paris, etc., etc. So there are lessons of how you can rise and succeed that follow often these court intrigues. So that today, as I mentioned, in the lycées of France, in the secondary school, students, high school students read Stendhal taken from his book called On Love. So when we have John Lvi-Martin and I teach a course on culture, and there's a famous book on love in California. It's not called In California, it's called Love in General, by a leading Berkeley sociologist who John worked with. And she's really talking about a California, very American middle-class conception of love. And so I like to contrast it with Stendhal, who has a much more romantic, abstract conception of love, and how frustration can be just the right amount to generate more romanticism. And so making yourself romantic and thinking about how to do it is what he writes about. Okay, by contrast, so then go through California, then all the way to Japan, where the Japanese high school students read Ruth Benedict's book called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, which explains to them who they are. And her answer is parents and children are related to one another through debt. And you were dependent and indebted, you're dependent upon and indebted to your parents for having brought you into life, and you should spend the rest of your life trying to make good that debt as best you can. And when they retire, when they're weak and elderly, you take care of them personally, you leave your job, you bring them to your home, you do anything you can. Or for example, if there's an accident in the street in Tokyo, don't go out and help the person who is bleeding, because that would create such a strong debt that person could never repay it to you, and that person would feel so indebted to you that you shouldn't do it. So leave them there bleeding until the government official arrives, and he can then help the person who is bleeding. Okay, so those are the big differences in norms associated with court life and gender roles, which go back to the French and the English as two extremes, with California in between. But just to make it simple, I mean the feminist style emerged with the nonconformist women in England as examples. They fought openly as women for abolition of slavery around 1750, 1770, before the Americans. They said, we the English should not have slaves in Africa. We should not be in the slave business. We should not be taking these black people to America or the Caribbean. We shouldn't do that. And so they wanted, and so this then continued in Boston, 1780, 1800. Some of the leading civic active organizations that Tocqueville wrote about were abolitionist women's groups, 1800, 1810, 1830. So that when Abraham Lincoln finally met a woman named Louisa May Alcott, he said, at least this is so-called, now maybe it's made up, we don't know. He said at least, or might have said, so you're the little lady who started the Great War. So that's the gender aspect of abolitionism and how it has place-making transformational impacts, which are, I mean, that example reverberates into Asia today because the traditional Asian pattern of Benedict, the chrysanthemum sword, young people always take care of their parents, doesn't work if the child is not with her parents. So young Koreans, young Chinese, young Japanese, as I mentioned, there's a cover of The Economist magazine where there's an Asian woman with wearing a raincoat, just walking away in the distance, and behind her is a handsome young man holding out roses on his knee, and she's just walking away from him. Gender roles are changing all the time. Any more?
Yes, two
Okay.
more. Every time you finish answering one, there's two
Okay.
more. Can you discuss how DIY placemaking differs from placemaking efforts put forth by city officials?
Okay, DIY, do-it-yourself placemaking is the term, maybe not invented, but sort of elaborated. I think probably most in the book we had by Gordon Douglas, and we showed a video of him. He was a TA in this course, a predecessor of this course, and he worked in Brooklyn. But he had examples from California, from Florida, internationally, and basically the idea is do-it-yourself is an extension of sort of citizen empowerment, that citizens have become so legitimate, and they think of themselves as the source of legitimacy for the government, that if the government staff doesn't do the job right, if they have a leaky drain pipe and water is dribbling onto a sidewalk for weeks or days or months, this is when it was in the video, the DIY folks then built a little wooden baby bridge that went over that leaking area so that people could walk over it rather than getting their feet wet or getting into that. Or they made little street signs which look like the normal street signs, but they're made to make a one-way street or to change something of that sort. So the point is, they felt that this was appropriate in solving a problem short term, which it would take, as they said repeatedly, it would take at least 6 to 12 months to get the government to do this if we went through the normal channels. We may have tried, and we did in another example, so we just did it ourselves. Okay, that's a quick answer. I mean, the contrast is put differently, what the Chinese are very much aware of this same concern. And I had, again, a TA in another course from Taiwan, and she'd worked as a journalist for several years in Taiwan on environmental issues. Then she covered mainland China. She covered the same issues. And her basic story was that in Taiwan, we talk about something, it becomes a crisis, it's in the press, the national government holds hearings, and then they don't do anything. In mainland China, there are no hearings, there's no protest. People send some emails to the government officials, and the government acts. No discussion. So an alternative to the DIY is maybe the hundreds of thousands, we don't know how many exactly, hundreds of thousands of Chinese officials who are answering these emails and doing things. So you can have, and that is with higher tech, you can have huge states that may be more responsive some of the time. I'm not saying it always works, but I'm just saying, look at the example, say, of Chinese students you know here. They do things, as Mayor Daley said, the Chinese can build a whole new airport in less than a year, whereas in 10 years, we're still fighting over extending one runway at O'Hare, and I can't get it approved. Okay. More questions?
Yes. Can you talk about Bobos?
Bubbles. Well, the quick and short, and so, I mean, take a look at the presentation by Hee-Sung Jung, I think in the second week, probably the second week of the course. I mean, her PhD is really on Bohemia, on Bobos. She has concepts, she has measures, she has menus in different neighborhoods illustrating the more Bohemian, and then basically Bobo is bohemian combined with bourgeois. And bohemian is sort of challenging authority, being more transgressive a little bit, combined with the money of the bourgeoisie. So you can afford to go to a restaurant, and you can afford to order a sandwich which has a combination of things which it normally does not or should not. That's the quick summary. The term was invented by David Brooks, New York Times writer, who's the speaker at the commencement in a day or two, if you want to sit in the back, or either if you want to throw popcorn or whatever, if you like it or dislike it. In any case, he's very smart. He's a USC grad. He's a member of the board of trustees of this university, not because he had millions of dollars, but because he's in the public eye, and he's continually on tap for NPR and political discussions. And he usually challenges the left, the traditional left and right. More?
We cleared.
That's it?
That's it
Okay.
from here.
Let me start. Okay, two other things I want to try that don't need to take long, but then see what we want to elaborate. Let me start a little bit on something and ask if any of you, maybe, or anybody who is willing, able to try to play a DVD on this machine so we can all listen to this. No video, it's just sound. Anybody want to? I mean, I've done it, and it's a little, and I've never. There are no instructions. It's sort of like a normal tape recorder or CD player, but and they're the same basic icons as in general, but I don't remember exactly what it is. And you got to choose, I think, DVD up there, and then put it in at the right place. Okay, see if you can get that working. Okay, but one thing I want to do with this is to join for you a little more coherently the discussion we had in the video of Wagner and music. We had a session. The session of the course was on festivals. So we showed, you've seen a couple of times, the Lollapalooza festivals as potentially transforming this place of Chicago, making Chicago a destination for cool young people. Okay, so sorry,
Yeah.
it's gonna. Okay, so let me just introduce a little bit, and then that's great. Thank you. Just right at the beginning. So it's only one side, and we'll just start at the beginning, and we go for maybe five, 10 minutes. Okay. I want to give you quick background. How do we join the empirical discussion of the festivals? And we had a couple of you made presentations on the festivals, and I would say the book and your presentations had very little theory. You didn't really theorize or interpret them very coherently. How can we do so? How can we interpret music? And we did this implicitly with the Fellini film, and I pointed you to the music in Fellini's more popular Italian music versus some of the more traditional classic German and Rossini. But in the same section on the reading list, there's a name which is Claude Lvi-Strauss, which we haven't talked about very much. What is there in Lvi-Strauss, and how might be good to listen to this, folks?
We have to wait for the.
Okay, if you got the exam, so no, for sure. Go ahead. You got 10 minutes for the exam, so please go ahead. And, obviously, you need to get settled and comfortable for the exam. But the we then showed you a little section, a couple of sections from Wagner, from two works of Wagner, and we showed you the Rheingold, which is the section where the gold was stolen from the Rhine maidens by Wotan and taken to build a new place, to create a new place, which was called Valhalla, which was the castle of the gods. All right. The second section we played briefly was from the Valkyrie, the second big operatic work. And the Valkyries are the ladies who traditionally were horseback riding in the sky, and in the video by Barenboim, they're sort of floating around and they're going up this bridge, so crossing back and forth across the bridge. So climbing into the sky was used both there and in the elevator up to Valhalla. But the important point of these visual, that is one way that, what I'm articulating a little bit more today is how to join these elements with a bigger conceptualization with some of the specifics of music and some of the general perspectives throughout the whole course that you've heard. And one thing is to point out I put it on the board, the Wagnerian concept of Gesamtkunstwerk, the holistic work of art. And basically he said, don't just write the music if you're a composer, you should also write the libretto yourself, and you should coach the actors, the singers, you should conduct the symphony, you should be involved with all stages in the creation of this art in order that it be an integrated artwork, and it will have, and you should write the music so that when people scream, you can hear the beginnings of that scream in the music building up to it, and then afterward you can hear reverberations of it 30 minutes or 3 hours later. You heard that scream transform, say the scream of the Rhine maidens. You're stealing the gold. You will be condemned. You will be damned. You will suffer because of this. And so that theme is played at the end of the Valkyrie, which is the end of the second opera, where you hear in this Protestant moralistic manner, there's sin, and sin is going to haunt you and transform the life which you were living. And so we're contrasting this with the Fellini-esque clowns going around, leading around, playing their musical instruments. The circus circle. So the circus circle with no problems, in a sense, is contrasted with a sin-infused, conflictual, multi-dimensional and internally conflicting image of life, and the court, in that sense, in Wagner's opera. Okay, so the distinctive piece we then want to add is how to make sense of this. Is this social science? And my answer is yes. And here I'm borrowing from a guy we haven't put on the board or haven't really played up very much before, but major figure, probably the most important anthropologist, at least of the 20th century, was Claude Lvi-Strauss. No, he wasn't in the gene business in San Francisco. He went to Brazil for a while, and he was in Paris, but he read a lot of the myths of the Brazilian, Argentine jungle people, and he theorized them in 4 volumes called Mythologique in French, and so it's translated by the USC Press. Basically, he's building a science of myth, and what he draws on most, as he says, his main source for the theory was Wagner. Okay, so let's play a little bit, if we may, and you can hear the sources of Levi-Strauss. So go ahead. We'll go from this to Levi-Strauss to scenes. And the themes, think of the 15 dimensions of
Score
scenes.
a number of inherent themes, each one associated with some element in the drama and developed in conjunction with that element throughout the work. These themes, or leading motives as they've come to be called, are not mere identification tags, nor is the score a simple patchwork made up by introducing each motive at the appropriate point of the stage action. Wagner's own description of his themes was melodic moments of feeling, and writing about his intentions beforehand, he said, "These melodic moments will be made by the orchestra into a kind of emotional guide throughout the labyrinthine structure of the drama." Wagner's motives have, in reality, a fundamentally psychological significance, and his score is a continuous symphonic development of them, reflecting the continuous psychological development of the stage action. In consequence, a comprehensive analysis of the Ring would be an enormous task. It would involve clarifying the psychological implications of all the motives and tracing their changing significance throughout the whole of their long and complex development. Nevertheless, understanding and enjoyment of the work can be greatly helped by simply establishing the identity of all the really important motives and indicating what immediate dramatic symbols they stand for, which is all that this introduction is intended to do.
This guy's
The motives
very
are associated
close.
with four
He's
different
speaking.
types of dramatic symbol:
He's the top
characters,
English
objects,
interpreter of
events,
Wagner.
and emotions. An example of a motive representing a character is the stern fanfare which introduces Hunding in Act 1 of Die Valkyrie. An example of a motive representing an object is the genial theme associated with Freya's golden apples. This is introduced in Scene 2 of Das Rheingold. It's sung by Fafner as he explains the value of the apples to Fasold. An example of a motive representing an event is the brief agitated figure on the woodwind which follows Alberic's threat of violence against the Rhine maidens in Scene 1 of Rheingold. An example of a motive representing an emotion is the furious repeated figure on the orchestra which portrays Siegfried's anger during Act 1 of Siegfried. These examples are only four of the almost innumerable motives in the Ring. But at the heart of this diversity, there's a simple unity. Practically all the motives arise from a few basic motives. Each of these basic motives represents one of the central symbols of the drama, and it generates a number of other motives by a process of transformation to represent various aspects of the central symbol concerned. And so we can thread our way through the jungle of motives in the Ring by grouping them into their different families. We can start from each basic motive in turn and trace the family of motives it generates throughout the Ring before continuing with the next basic motive. The fundamental symbol in the Ring is the world of nature, from which everything arises and to which everything returns. And Wagner's basic motive for this ultimate source of existence is that fundamental element in music, the major chord. This chord, spread out melodically as a rising major arpeggio by the horns, forms the mysterious nature motive which opens the whole work. This is the original form of the nature motive. It soon undergoes a simple melodic transformation into a peacefully undulating string theme, and the result is what may be called the definitive form of the nature motive, since this is the form in which it will recur throughout the whole work. The next transformation is that this definitive form of the nature motive simply begins to move at twice the speed, and in so doing it becomes a new motive, the surging motive of the River Rhine. Tracing further the family of motives generated by the basic nature motive, we must pass on now to scene 4 of the Rheingold for the next transformation. Here the nature motive, by turning from major to minor, and from a flowing 6/8 to a slow 4/4 time, becomes the dark motive of Erda, the earth goddess.
Okay, that gives you a flavor how you can start with a core number of simple themes like good and bad or rural and urban, and then begin to build out to natural, neighborliness, localistic, and so forth, and then see where and how much they combine, and by combining with one another in different combinations, you can generate all sorts of themes or scenes. And so Wagner stressed the emotional, the artistic power of the music and the action linked with, let me add another critical theme which he added here, which is not in that commentary, the citizen. That is, he was an early democrat of the arts. He didn't want democratic elections, but he basically said a creative, talented artist to be successful must take his material from the people, das Volk, and take folk stories, folk songs, folk myths, then revise them, enhance them, transform them so they become more powerful, more elegant, more poetic, add newer music that does this kind of thing. And that then was done with enough mastery that Stendhal in France and Wagner in Germany were the leading founders of European nationalism in the early 19th century. And so we're dealing with aspects of that today with Trump, with China, with North Korea. We're having renovations and then efforts to transform this as we go on. Let me make that a linkage of that last sentence with, just two more words on Lvi-Strauss. So Lvi-Strauss basically says, cultural analysis, and he's talking not only of his 4 volumes, but of works that you and I can and might be doing for the years to come, can take these kinds of perspectives of how to take this material from people, from myths. And so Levi-Strauss spent his whole career reading these source materials and then codifying them. So he has hundreds of these. So he has number 3, myths 379 from the Brazilian Amazon. You know, if a man thought that he would be dominant, but he instead is crushed by his wife, and so for the rest of his life, he's trying to live with a fish and to do other things, but so then he adds, this is what happened in a matriarchal society. That is a matriarchy, which you partially have among African Americans in American cities today. You have women and you have labels, 4-letter words about mothers related to an anti-maternalistic style, which is a different linguistic symbol of the myths and of the styles of reacting against authority based on a kinship change of the sort that is core for Levi-Strauss, of kinship. So the Oedipus conflict shifts from being a man versus his father to being a man versus his mother, or a daughter versus each gender based on the structure of. So in Levi-Strauss, he looks variations of kinship, of linguistics, of language, and there's lots of linguistic transformation of how you get from a grammar of transforming a particular style of speech or a particular myth into something else through combining wax and ashes. Honey and Ashes are titles of some of his books, and these primordial beginnings of civilization can be built up, combined, transformed if we pursue them with enough thoroughness and seriousness. So that's his program. He then developed this in many books. There's certain followers. Most anthropologists who follow Levi-Strauss have worked on his kinship, but very few have worked on myth. So the myth, I would say, the ways of using this to study social media, the way that Lauren is doing now, the way of thinking, what are the categories we have, and where and how does fandom change if it becomes matriarchal or patriarchal, or if we have revolt against authority, or legitimate, seeking to legitimate authority. How do those things shift the way that the content of these things work? One more question came in, which I just saw, which is how does Faulkner relate to the course? I would say I invoked it for, I mean, a quick answer and then a more complex answer is behind it. The quick answer is to look at the cultural sources and the way, it's the same point as Stepanica, Brown, Saraceno, and of Habermas. How does culture transform the way we see things which we think are obvious, like race? Race in the American South is supposed that we sort of know a story from the national media, from the American public school history books. You know, race slavery, the background of slavery, of blacks versus whites, of domination, the civil rights movement, all of that. Faulkner is perhaps the greatest American novelist, has a different interpretation. What he brings in is how does culture get created, and how does that in turn transform how we see who we are? And I would say the basic message of Faulkner is not to see black versus white, but to see both of them deeply interrelated with each other. They made love with each other, they had children of mixed races, they had battles, and battles continue from generation to generation among individuals. You have jealousy, you have resentment, you have stealing of land, stealing of horses, people killing each other in response to that, 50 years, 75 years later, etc. So it's the interconnection of everybody with everybody else is one lesson. Second lesson, the leader, the hero of Light in August, one of his 4 great novels, was, just to join back to my earlier phrase, like, it wasn't quite as simple as Louisa May Alcott, but his hero was an abolitionist. He lived during the Civil War. He refused to serve in the Confederate Army. His daughters hid him in a room in their great big house, and they fed him for 4 years because the Confederate officers made this big house one of their headquarters. So he was living there right next to the Confederate officer headquarters. His daughters were feeding him secretly, and he managed to live all the way through the Civil War as an abolitionist, hiding out while the owner of the house was out fighting with the troops. So you have multiple themes and interrelations of the same kind of that's that. So the importance of culture and the independence of culture and of people redefining themselves, politics, social relations, hierarchy, in ways that none of this is set in stone, but was and could be transformed, sometimes through violence, murder, theft, or more peaceful negotiation, or other kinds of things. And then of course in the case of Wagner and Faulkner, doing it with an artistic brilliance that has captured the use of language, of choice of words, but choosing themes which resonate in a way with others which are, if not universal, at least cover a lot of the world. So Faulkner read Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov once a year. And the village in a small town in Russia, in Dostoevsky, and Yokneam-Patawpata County in Mississippi for Faulkner were both images of the world. They were biblical. They aim both to be worldwide, universal, say quasi-universal kinds of statements, and so the biblical sources go back there and define a sense of strong morality of right and wrong, but based on distinctive cultures that both of those writers were very sensitive about the fragility of all of this, and how the whole thing could go up in smoke and flames, as it did in the film Gone with the Wind, which is the most popular film in the world, showing as in the end of the four works of Wagner. The last one is called The Twilight of the Gods, and at the end, I'll tell you the end because it doesn't. Seeing the whole thing is still, you still need to see to see the subtlety. In the end, the Valhalla castle is burned, and the gods die in that sense. So that it's the end of the world, and that image. So that is, it's not the Hollywood-esque, and the good versus the bad cowboy, and we shall all live happily ever Okay, different world perspectives, different subcultures are battling with one another. The other theme I wanted to ask, we don't have a lot of people right here, but let's at least raise the issue and think about it. What can you do, and do we have examples around, what can you do to be a creative placemaker yourself? What are there in the examples of people you know from the USC, your fellow students or recent fellow students, that might help you be more creative in making your place different in the years to come? Anybody doing something now that you're thinking of in these terms you want to mention as an example, or even problems you're having? Kelvin?
This may be a little off, but there's this thing called memes and like Facebook meme pages, and it kind of creates a lot of dialogue on campus. So like, if a fraternity does something bad, there'll be a lot of memes about it, and then people start talking more about that event, and then you'll go to a party and you'll hear people discussing the memes and the funny things, and then the bad things, and then how do we change those bad things, and like what policies should be put in place, and it kind of starts this conversation, and I think that's kind of what I'm talking about.
Okay, that's great, and that's an excellent example. Another example, anybody in your own career, or people that you've seen doing things, or things you're thinking about. Career is too early a phrase, but say a couple of job options or volunteer activities in summer jobs. I ask in terms of former students that I've worked with and who are now in other places, include Toni Preckwinkle and her husband, who were students here when I first started teaching here. And I'll just mention one example. She basically got Obama into power. I mean, she helped Obama get going in Illinois politics. And there's a story on this in the New Yorker magazine where she's the main source. And she's very critical of Obama. She felt he wasn't really, didn't remember the people who helped him get going and so forth. But it's related to issues of racial integration and black nationalism. And the civil rights movements were basically in favor of pressing us with Martin Luther King toward more racial integration, more tolerance in the 50s and 60s. With Stokely Carmichael in the mid to late 60s, black nationalism in the book that Carmichael and Hamilton wrote called Black Power triumphed. The raised fist symbol. And the civil rights organizations today are still basically following black nationalist style. When that started, Toni Preckwinkle, I'm just mentioning, went to the first public speech in Chicago by Stokely Carmichael, and he was standing up on the podium, and on his left and right, these guys with big guns and bullets across their chest. And she put up her hand and said, "How come you have to have those stooges on your, or do you need those stooges on your left and right?" Okay, so that's her style, which, I mean, she said that as a college student. Imagine that style. So she has been a creative placemaker. That is, she has transformed the south side of Chicago. She made Bronzeville, it was filled with rundown, This area was written about by William Julius Wilson, African-American, top sociologist here and at Harvard, in a series of books about class, deindustrialization, unions, and how the underclass, which he then called the ghetto, and then he said different labels, that is, the poorest people suffer the most, and how they've made a place which is distinctively bad and troubled. And many of the problems of African Americans come from growing up in this kind of place. Okay, Toni Preckwinkle, in a sense, does not accept that. She's basically saying, I'm going to change this. And she has actively changed it through much of her career, and she has had at least enough support, enough enthusiasm behind her, that in the surveys, when Rahm Emanuel ran for mayor the second time, the Tribune and Sun-Times survey showed that Toni Preckwinkle had more than twice as much support as Rahm Emanuel if she wanted to run for mayor. So she may do so, but the more general point I'm making is she has a Calvinist do good works. Let's solve the problem, not just talk about the racism. In contrast, say Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson will do both. He can give a speech about racism when he's in Wall Street or Capitol Hill. When he's talking to a black high school, say, you got to pull yourself up by your own boots. Nobody's going to do it for you. So okay. So my general point from that is many different students here, especially, have followed different models, and the old Calvinist New England model of looking for ways to solve problems rather than just labeling them. The Adorno style, just to contrast, say Adorno basically created what's called what he and they've since called critical sociology, which is basically showing what's wrong and bad about a phenomenon, an institution, or in this example, advertising. How advertising makes capitalism work is the way he suggests. And that when, however, he did that in 1967, 68 with his students, the students were furious with him that he would not support any particular policy position, and he only said, the world has gotten so bad that all we can do is criticize it. We can't expect to change it. And the students were furious, and as I told you how he died. So anyway, that's how the Twilight of the Gods may be one alternative ending, but there are many other endings, and you are there to choose your own. So that's our ending of the course. Thank you, folks.